Welcome to the second presentation dealing with Chapter 24, World War I. And we're going to pick up with Section 3, the United States is drawn into the war. Now, the United States, from its inception, was very much tied in to the notion that when it came to foreign affairs, especially with respect to issues dealing with the continent of Europe, we might say that it was expressed best in its most formal sense with the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which we talked about earlier in the year. The United States was basically taking the position at that time. The immediate context was liberation in Latin America. Countries such as Mexico were gaining independence. That occurred, for example, in Mexico in 1821, and many followed suit shortly thereafter. And as you recall, the Monroe Doctrine said, we will stay out of Europe's affairs, and they need to stay out of ours, in our neighborhood, in the Americas, in other words. And we, as a nation, had an attitude of not wanting to involve ourselves, especially in European issues. And the idea of sending American young men off to a foreign field somewhere to potentially die would not be worth it. And so, and from the earliest days, George Washington, took that position of suggesting that as a nation we do not enter into the fray, but we remain neutral regarding these foreign issues, and it is for the betterment of the country. So, why did the United States eventually get involved in the First World War? Well, a couple things we might suggest. First of all, some would suggest that there was a natural sympathy for the Allies, especially the United Kingdom or Great Britain. Historically, Britain was, the UK was always the leading trading partner with the United States. Obviously, our country was derived from a basic English system. We share the same language, many of the same cultural characteristics. When you look at the history of Christian thought, Protestantism, any host of issues, a natural sympathy for the Allies was there. Another aspect that comes into play here is the German use of submarines. The German U-boat used by the German Navy, they began to sink Allied shipping, and they would sink ships from any nation that was considered to be helping the Allies, even if they were not directly part of the conflict. Now, the first issue we want to talk about specifically is the sinking of the Lusitania, which was kind of a unique situation. About 10 miles off the coast of Ireland, a passenger liner was sunk May 7th, 1915. There were some Americans on board. The Germans justified this sinking by suggesting that the ship was containing weaponry and arms that would be used against Germany, and they thus were justified in sinking this passenger liner. Now, whether or not there were arms on board, that's one of the mysteries of history. If you're interested in that, you can start investigating, but historians seem to be not in total agreement as to what exactly is the case there. But nonetheless, it sparked international outrage that the Germans would sink a passenger liner and kill civilians. And so in the early spring of 1916, Germany pledged not to sink ships without warning. In other words, we'll let you offload, get into lifeboats, and then we'll sink your ship, that sort of thing. The final break with Germany came, though, as you can see in Section D, their unrestricted submarine warfare. After the 1st of February, German submarines basically had the green light to sink any ships in a war zone without warning. If they were considered to be unfriendly or in any way an aid to the enemy, they would be sunk. Also, in early 1917, March 1st, a letter was published in American newspapers. It was intercepted by British agents. It's called the Zimmermann Note. And the Zimmermann Note proposed a German-Mexican alliance. Basically, the Germans promised the territory they had lost, the territory that Mexico had lost during the Mexican War, which we talked about earlier, 1847, 1848, 1846 to 1848. They proposed that Mexico would receive this land back if they allied themselves with Germany and Germany won the war. And of course, when this went public, it created a tremendous stir in the United States. The United States declared war on April 6th, 1917, and we entered it into the fray in Europe. Now, there, by the way, is a German U-boat. The U-boat was used in the First World War and then into the Second World War as well. They did a lot of damage in the Atlantic, sinking a lot of merchant vessels, as well as naval vessels. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later is the development of the destroyer to deal with submarines. Now, mobilizing for war, the United States instigated a draft, and they also they rationed food and fuel. They also created something called the War Industries Board, headed by a man named Bernard Baruch. Basically, this board had the power of a federal bureaucracy, as it were, and they could dictate certain things in terms of determining numbers of military vehicles, arms, what have you, things needing to be produced for the war. It gave government a much greater control over those decisions as to what to produce, how much to produce, and so forth. In the Second World War, arguably, there was more of a, as it were, a partnership between government and industries. But this was an unprecedented step in the late 19-teens, this kind of board would be created to give that much power and authority. Now, in terms of Section 5, Allies win the war. Germany invaded Belgium and France, and one of the chief characteristics of the First World War is that there were not great offensive capabilities in play when the opposing side dug in. And World War I was characterized by trench warfare. They dug trenches, and every now and then one side would have their soldiers jump out of the trenches and try and attack, and they took just tremendous casualties, horrendous numbers of people killed and wounded in these, especially these major offensives. And this is where the gas warfare concept was introduced. Gas warfare was such that if you were upwind of an enemy, you could release these canisters of poison gas downwind toward the enemy, and it was sort of like a potential silent killer. And so you'll notice that people wore gas masks or had their mask with them in the First World War to keep from getting injured or killed by the gases that would be inhaled. Just a footnote: my grandfather McLean was injured in a gas attack, burned his lungs when he was in Europe during World War One. Early important battles: Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Jutland, which was a huge naval battle. We're not going to go into great details there, but suffice it to say that by 1915, there was a stalemate. The Germans made it partway into northeastern France, and then they largely stopped. Now, the United States entered the war in April, and their commander was John J. Pershing. The American soldiers were referred to as doughboys. Now, that term, there are different theories as to where that term came from. Some think it has to do with the buttons on their uniforms. Nonetheless, the Americans under Pershing headed to Europe, and they began to fight side by side with the French and British. Well, that concludes section 2, and we will be back for section 3 momentarily.